With this, I will welcome you all to this webinar on the nexus between terrorism, firearm trafficking, and trafficking in person, organized by the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Person, which in short is ICAT. This is the second webinar of a three-part series that seeks to increase our understanding of the nexus between trafficking in person and serious organized crimes. Understanding that connection will help to better respond to the crimes, protecting and supporting victims. Obviously, in working on preventing and combating transnational organized crimes and terrorism, analyzing the nexus remains essential because of the interconnected nature of these threats. While firearm trafficking might seem like the most direct facilitator of terrorism, it also plays a critical, though less obvious, role in facilitating trafficking in persons by creating an environment of fear and instability. Additionally, the manipulation and exploitation inherent in human trafficking, combined with the sophisticated use of online propaganda for recruitment, the misuse of technologies to evade detection and finance operations, makes identify this nexus incredibly challenging. And the reality is that this entire nexus is often far more insidious and difficult to detect. But fortunately, today we have four dynamic panelists who will share their work, their powerful insight, and practical recommendations that are directly tied to the important discussion of today. And I will introduce them in a moment. But first, allow me to give you a brief background on the ICAT and the webinar series. As mentioned, ICAT stands for the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Person. It is a policy forum that was established in 2007 by the United Nations General Assembly to enhance cooperation and coordination among UN agencies and other relevant international organizations for a coordinated and comprehensive approach to preventing and to combating trafficking in person. ICAT provides a platform for, among others, exchange of information, exchange of experiences, exchanges in good practices in anti-trafficking efforts, and today's webinars is a direct response to this objective. We have 31 members entities drawn from the United Nations system and other international regional organizations that currently form ICAT. UNODC is the permanent coordinator and hosts the ICAT Secretariat, and its work draws from the diverse membership and expertise of its members. In 2025, ICAT is co-chaired by UNODC and the Organization of American States, who have set the agenda for the year, guided by 6 annual priorities that align with the broad-based multi-year plan of action that was adopted in December 2020. About the ICAT series that ICAT has created for these years, it responds to the broader effort to build the evidence base on trafficking in person and covers 3 diverse and also very important topics. Corruption ties to trafficking in person, that was the webinar on the 2nd of July. Terrorism, firearm trafficking, and trafficking in person, which is the topic of today. And last, on trafficking in person and cyber-enabled crime, which will be held on the next 25th of September. The webinar series aims to gather policy recommendations for strengthening the response to trafficking in persons, particularly in relation to its links with other forms of organized crimes, and the collected recommendation will help shape future messaging for states and relevant stakeholders. Now, before moving to the interesting part of the day, I would like to quickly share a few housekeeping rules. Firstly, we will invite our experts to share their insights. Afterwards, once all presentations have been concluded, we will then open the floor for discussion. At this point, I kindly request you to hold please your question until the end. Keep your microphone muted, please, and also to contribute to ask questions, use the raise hand features in the Microsoft Teams and wait to be invited before unmuting. Alternatively, at any time, you can post your question in the chat box during the discussion, and they will be answered at the end. Please address your question to a specific panelist. I would like to inform you that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be published on the ICAT website. Now, I'm delighted to finally introduce our panelists, and I would like to remind our expert to conclude their intervention within 10 minutes in order to keep the webinar on schedule and leave us enough time for the discussion. First, we have Pierre De Luca from the Organization of American States. Pierre serves as the Chief of Conventional Arms, Ammunition and Explosives Section at the Organization of American States, where she leads efforts to combat illicit firearms trafficking across Latin America and the Caribbean. As a Brazilian lawyer with a master's degree in criminology, Pierre coordinates significant programs like the Program of Assistance on Control of Arms and Ammunition, and she has directed the regional projects such as the Central American Firearms Roadmap and provides strategic technical support to member states for arms control compliance. Pierre, it is a pleasure to have you today. And given the complex links between trafficking in person, firearms trafficking, and terrorism, how is the OAS helping member states respond more effectively to these overlapping threats? Additionally, we would appreciate any recommendation that you may have for strengthening the response to this interconnection. Pierre, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaia. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are on the globe. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I wanted to thank ICAT for the invitation and also congratulate ICAT for this series of webinars that are promoting very interesting discussions on the interconnections of trafficking persons with other modalities of organized crime and terrorism. So to answer that question, I have a brief presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it's going to work well. Just give me one moment. If you can just confirm that you're okay, perfect. So since I have the privilege of being the first panelists intervening this morning, I think to set a little bit of the stage, I wanted to just highlight some of these linkages between firearms trafficking, trafficking in persons, and terrorism. So first of all, I think it's important to highlight that these linkages are multidimensional and are mutually reinforcing, and we can organize them in several categories. So both firearms trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, they thrive where there is low institutional capacities. So there are common enablers. Some of them in the region relates to weak border control and surveillance, corruption at enforcement points, gaps in police intelligence, data generation, data analysis, understaffed justice and security institutions, which can all facilitate these illegal flows. We also see the convergence of illicit markets. So traffickers take advantage of sharing smuggling routes, overlapping logistics and transport infrastructure. They're very efficient organizations. So of course they can all try to take advantage of these things like the corrupt facilitators and also the interlinked supply chains. So particularly with the case of firearms, what we see is that firearms traffickers, they provide weapons to trafficking persons networks because those networks will use firearms to intimidate, threaten, control trafficking persons victims, and also to escape law enforcement. So weapons are very key for their operation. And also what we see is that weapons are exchanged as a currency in criminal transactions between these groups. And of course, there's also financial conversions of all these modalities of organized crime, in particular in the case of terrorism as well, that the profits from all of these criminal enterprises, they have to take part of like money laundering schemes, financial schemes, and also what we see is that they reinforce each other. So profits from one criminal activity is used to fund operations of another modality and vice versa. So to better address this threat and the challenges that they pose in the region, in the globe, it's very critical for law enforcement to better understand what are those linkages, what are these points of convergence. And to tackle that and to have that understanding, we need coordinated responses. And we need to start with data collection, data analysis that generate intelligence that can be applied to policy making and to law enforcement strategies, and particularly in terms of also be applied for cross-border cooperation in a more efficient way. So what are we doing at the OAS considering those linkages? And I'm going to focus on what the section of conventional arms, ammunition, and Explosives is doing, so the initiatives that are led by us. That does not mean that we don't have other initiatives at the OAS that also tackle those convergences. This is from the firearms standpoint, but also looking at this comprehensive picture and connecting with the work of the other sections at the OAS. And I want to focus on data generation, the generation of knowledge, and then one specific component on the operational support that we provide to law enforcement. All of our activities are implemented in the framework of the Program of Assistance and Control of Arms and Ammunition, PACAM. PACAM is currently funded by the European Union and the government of Italy. And it's our comprehensive program to support OAS member states in reducing armed violence and addressing firearms trafficking. We provide support in a number of components, from legislative assistance to capacity building, to development and implementation of IT tools, information sharing, coordination strategies like the sub-regional roadmaps, and prevention of armed violence in the community level. In the QR code in the slide, you can access more information about PACAM, because unfortunately, due to the time, I cannot detail all right now. But I'm gonna focus on, as I said, on data collection and data analysis, and that's we are doing through the hemispheric study on the illicit trafficking of firearms and ammunition. That's our permanent effort to generate knowledge about firearms trafficking and ammunition trafficking in the Americas. It has a modular methodology that it was funded by the government of Mexico, and it was built in collaboration with a number of expert organizations, some of them that are sharing the panel with me today. It has 5 modules that seeks to better understand how we can effectively prevent the illicit trade of firearms, their components, and ammunition in the Americas. The first module focuses on understanding the characteristics, the illicit, like including the routes, the actors, how they operate, the flows of firearms trafficking, and that, of course, also looks at the connection with other illegal flows in the region, including, for instance, trafficking in persons. And that's something that we are planning to do in coordination with UNODC, considering what UNODC already does for the global study on firearms trafficking. And then we have the second module that focuses on identifying and evaluating state capacities to address firearms trafficking. What are the current gaps on state capacities? The third module focuses on the impact of firearms trafficking and ammunition. The fourth on trends and threats. And finally, the last module, considering all the data, all the knowledge, how can we provide targeted recommendations for the member states to improve their policies to address firearms trafficking. So the methodology was developed and was approved by our member states, and now we are working on implementing it. We have already launched a publication on trends and threats related to arms and ammunition trafficking in the Americas, that it's accessible through the QR code in the slide. And we are currently implementing Module 2 that focuses on evaluating state capacities, that is funded by Mexico and is being implemented in cooperation with UNIDIR, and finalizing a partnership with civil society organizations so we can implement Module 3. And I wanted to highlight Module 3 that focuses on the impact of arms and ammunition trafficking, because with a gender perspective, because we're going beyond the traditional analysis of just looking at homicide rates or specific offenses that are committed with firearms trafficking. It's being proposed 5 dimensions of analysis that will look at the impact on public health, economy, governance, quality of life, and illicit economies. And on illicit economies particularly, we are trying to understand how arms trafficking contribute to the expansion of other illicit activities and how they interact. So there are a lot of variables there that look at the different offenses and different patterns of trafficking in persons, so we can try to see how one is reinforcing the other. We are implementing this now in the second semester of this year, and we believe by the beginning of next year, we're going to have the data already available, and we're going to be able to cross with the data that is emerging from the state capacities module, the trends and threats, and have a much deeper understanding of what these linkages, and have targeted recommendations of how law enforcement can better address them. And not only law enforcement, but also how other agencies can address and prevent both trafficking in persons and firearms trafficking. And because it's not enough to generate data, we also have to make that data available. So other agencies, other civil society organizations, our member states can take advantage of that. We are now launching at the end of this month the Firearms and Ammunition Knowledge Platform, which is a centralized repository of data on firearms and ammunition in the Americas. And that's going to have interactive dashboards with the data that is coming from these data collection tools. There is also a private interface for our member states to submit the data on all these tools. And the interesting part of this is that this platform is being developed or was developed considering the reference of the Trafficking Persons Knowledge Platform. That is another platform available at the OAS. This one is already live, available online. That it's a centralized repository of official information and data on human trafficking in the Americas. And through that platform, we collect and we make available data on how our member states are implementing the hemispheric work plan that it was approved by our member states to address trafficking persons. So on that platform, in the public interface, you have regional maps with information by country, you have dashboards with thematic sections. And what we are going to do is integrate that. Once we have the data from the firearms platform, we can integrate across the data and take advantage of other tools like the Inter-American Security Observatory, where we have organized crime related data from like trafficking, drug trafficking, smuggling of migrants, trafficking of weapons. And we believe that with the integration of this data in a single site, we're going to be able to share some insights with our member states and be able to make more evidence-based policies. And to finalize, because I know that I'm running out of time, I just wanted to briefly mention some of the operational assistance that we offer, and that focus specifically on law enforcement. So in collaboration with Interpol, we are focusing now on strengthening firearms tracing. Firearms are not traced in the Americas. That means, or are barely traced. It means that law enforcement is not able to identify trafficking patterns, to identify where those illegal firearms are coming from. And of course, if they don't know where they're coming from, it's very difficult for us to have like evidence-based policies. So what we're doing right now is offering support for law enforcement agencies so they can have firearms recovery protocols, they can have the training, the tools available to effectively trace the firearms. That includes cross-border operations. So we can generate intelligence reports, and those reports can be used not only to guide police work, but also for policymakers to close those gaps and have more evidence-based policies. And some of those police operations, there is one being planned for the second semester with Interpol. It's the cross-border police operations is not only focused on firearms trafficking, but looking at all sorts of organized crime and illegal flows, so drugs trafficking, trafficking persons. And we hope that the report that is generated after that will be very enlightening for how we can better address the phenomenon. So that's what very briefly I had to say this morning, and I'm looking forward to deep some of those topics in our discussion. Thank you, Gaia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pierre, for setting the floor with such a structured presentation. We certainly demonstrate the strength of the OAS approach in working on the linkages and the valuable example of the integrated data analysis of the initiatives that you implement to support law enforcement. So thank you. Our second panelist is Tarana Bagirova, the Financial Investigations Programs Lead at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Tarana leads several portfolios of the Office of the OSCE Special Representative that cover financial intelligence into human trafficking, technology-facilitated trafficking, and trafficking for forced criminality, with a particular focus on grave crimes related to drugs and terrorism. Her work on terrorism and trafficking nexus has been serving as a key reference point for criminal justice practitioners in examining cases related to returnees from the conflict areas. Tarana, welcome. I understand that in 2021, OSCE produced a report that explored the intersection between trafficking in persons and terrorism and provided policy recommendations. Can you please take us through the findings of this report and what it proposes for an effective response to the linkages? Thank you.
Thank you, Gaia. I hope you can see my screen. Thanks for inviting the OECU to share our findings, the research that we've done back in 2021. Although it's been a while since we've done this publication, today's webinar proves, and today's conversation, that this conversation is still very much relevant and needed, because trafficking is an evolving crime, and we can see already the convergence with different other crimes, and increasingly with the violent crimes like terrorism. So in the course of 3 years, we've conducted an extensive desk research through all publicly available data. We discussed with many experts, both in terrorism and trafficking field. We discussed with states, NGOs, international organizations, to understand what's the connection between these two crimes. We also tried to analyze also disciplines, because it was very important for us to understand how much, what kind of recommendations, whether there is a recommendations when we look at on prevention, on protection, on prosecution of both crimes. So we were able to collect around 60 cases through our partners, through other people, the experts and NGOs and civil society, and some of them we also received from the international organizations, and some of them from the state discussion with the states. We were able to collect 60 cases. Just to make it clear that not all of these 60 cases are pure trafficking cases, but they had an extensive, after extensive deliberations and discussions and examining each of those cases that we received, we came to the conclusion that there are similarities and differences, and some of those elements that we could see in those cases actually does amount to human trafficking committed by terrorist groups. Particularly, we're looking at the period of 2016-2020, which was when the ISIL was very active in Syria and Iraq.
Elena, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but participants said that they can only see the first slide of your presentation. If you are moving through the slides, they cannot see it. So maybe if you put... No, me neither. So maybe if you put in a presentation mode, they can see it. I don't know if you prefer to do that or... Presentation. Okay, now it's moving.
It is moving now? Okay,
now it's moving.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank
That's
you.
the second one.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, thank you very much. Luckily, I was on the second slide, so it didn't go too far. So a second recommendations that we developed actually looks at and how we can prevent it, and what's the protection mechanisms that could be used that is already existed in trafficking field that could be utilized when we're talking about trafficking suspicions or trafficking acts committed by terrorist groups. So when we wanted to look at those crimes, we first looked at what are the differences, because particularly the major difference, I will not go into all of those differences that we looked at, particularly legal and policy framework, but what was the main issue for us to understand, what's the purpose of criminal intent when we're looking at terrorism and trafficking, because these are two distinct crimes. The purpose of the criminal intent of human trafficking differs from that of terrorism, indeed. And intent of the trafficker is to exploit the person and gain profit or advantage from their exploitation. But in terrorism cases, in the intent of terrorism is often understood as intimidation of a population, of compelling of a government or international organization to do or refrain from doing any act. So that also brought a lot of discussions around, because for trafficking, for a case to be qualified as trafficking or amount to trafficking, we at least need two, particularly in adult cases, when we have acts and at least the intent of exploitation. So this was very important for us to understand, and I will delve into that as I go into my deeper into my slides. But despite those differences that we could identify, whereas terrorism being more punitive, crime more stricter, whereas trafficking also had a lot of focus on victim protection, and victim is the center of the crime, indeed. But we could see the similarities. There are lots of similarities around these 60 cases, and I will go into each of those acts and means and exploitative purposes to describe what we mean by that. So when we looked at the trafficking acts, particularly the acts committed by terrorist groups like ISIL, probably the first organization, terrorist group, actually, that was able to harness in such a massive scale the technology. So they used technology quite actively, widely, to groom, provide or do deceptive promises of idyllic life, romance, and gainful employment towards adults, vulnerable adults. There was an increasingly cyber enticement, grooming, the use of lover boy technique to recruit vulnerable adults, but there were also a lot of focus on minors and youth, particularly. We could see how they were sequencing their actions by identifying potential victim first on social media, establishing a relationship of trust, subsequently entrapping them into exploitative situation. Children were particularly at risk due to their specific vulnerabilities, and the threat of trafficking, exploiting children online is anyway growing, and we could see it already now. Again, it's a massive scale. So what we could see in ACT, which was very similar to how the online grooming of sexual exploitation of children usually happens, manipulation. So that was widely used as a technique by the terrorist group like ISIL to
Elena,
to
I'm
reach
so very
certain
sorry to interrupt you
Yeah.
again, but the same problem seems to happen. So maybe you can click
Yeah.
directly the slide that you want to select.
But like
I'm
this,
so sorry.
is
It's
it
just
good
because
now?
it's an interesting presentation and then without the proper slide
Yes.
missing out. So
Do
sorry
you
to
see it
interrupt
now?
again. Yes, yes.
Is it
And
now okay?
yes, it's
Okay.
now visible. Slide 5.
All right,
Yes.
I will keep it like this then, because if I press the slide mode and it disappears, seems like it doesn't
Okay,
work.
now just click on the correct slide. Also, yeah, to alert you that you are half through your time. Okay, thank you
Okay,
so much.
fantastic.
Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry for that. So when we're talking on acts, particularly the case, one of the recent cases which happened in the UK, and this is a case, it happened after we released the report, but we discussed it during our country visit in the UK, is that this case, which was who was the youngest girl.
Oh dear. What?
We are not listening anything.
I think the connection. We lost the connection, maybe, Gaia?
Yes, I think so. I was just waiting a few moments. Maybe sometimes it's frozen and it's starting again. We could also invert the order and let's give just like
Will do something that
Okay.
is amounts to terrorism. So this case has been then dropped once the case opened as a terrorism offense against the child, but after the new elements came out, the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service of UK, actually sent the case back to the Home Office and said, this you guys will have to look at this case back again as a victim of modern slavery. Anyway, while the case was still ongoing, and the child, because it was already under the under social care, was actually already been isolated by the family, and then ended up with a suicide. But this case is one of the widely used case, which shows how the recruitment act element is very important to look at in the cases of when the person is exploited in the criminal offenses and grave offenses like terrorism, how particularly the young persons or children are being used. The next the element of the tracking cycle is the means element that we were engaged by looking at examining what kind of means were used by terrorist groups, and we could see there are different there are particularly deception and coercion and force has been used, but mostly deception and abuse of the position of vulnerability were used in the recruitment phase. But once the victim, once an individual child or adult was already in the spot, was already groomed, then the compulsion and force was used actually to control that person. So one of those cases that I'd like to show you here is the case that was adjudicated back in 2022 in Norway, which brought one of the largest case, which we also learned was largely also based on the papers that we established in 2021, that this case showed how an adult who actually voluntarily joined ISIL back in 2014 to 2016 And but the judges came to the point that her bringing up her own child cannot amount to the support to terrorist groups, but her active household and support to the husband is actually amounts to support to terrorist groups. But what happened after that, once the ISIL was defeated and she was then kept in those areas and she could not leave, then her stay became non-voluntary and more compulsive, and she was threatened and subjected to violence. So the conditions in Al-Hol refugee camp, where she was then put until 2020, were very inhumane. So the judges came to the conclusion that she was both victim and the perpetrator in this case. And she was sentenced in imprisonment of 1 year and 4 months, but she was considered that she actually served it in custody in remand, and she was actually freed. So this case actually shows how the change in circumstances, which we also elaborate in our paper, is one of the crucial moments when we're talking about the particular trafficking committed by terrorist groups. Because even if the person joins the group involuntarily, the circumstances may change, and even if a person wants to disengage, they may not have much of options to disengage. So when we looked at the terrorist purposes, which is like, what's the purpose of terrorism? And that brings a lot of discussions of why the terrorist groups would engage in trafficking human beings. So the compiled data and analysis showed us that the terrorist groups target the people for their utility. So they indicate that they use the sexual violence, if they were raped, there was sexual slavery. There are lots of cases that were compiled, and we used it as illustrative examples. These are the real case examples, by the way. We're not looking at specific country, we're only indicating the region where it happened. They did use the sex slaves as a pull factor. Additionally, widespread rape and forced marriage was also used by terrorist groups, with the aim to establish the future generation of ISIL fighters. So the purposes of exploitation was there. And when we looked at the gender and age, just to very briefly mention, I've heard them run around late a bit, that there have been very diverse profiles of men and women. So not all women traveled there non-voluntary, and not all of them traveled there was voluntary, was the informed decision. Most of them were deceived and forced into labor. There were lots of also single migrant workers that were looked at the cases, which actually thought they were going to work in the construction sites, and we're talking about the male that ended up in the combat roles. When we looked at the children, there were different types of children, and what we could see, for example, from the Shamim Begum's case, the children of that age were groomed through the loverboard technique, and then ended up in a situation where they had to marry after the death of their husbands and remarry again and have lots of babies. So we could also see lots of children, of course, ended up with getting as a result of the rape, or they were pulled there by their family members, by their parents. So the age and gender dimension of people engaged, all being looked at from terrorist angles, have been quite diverse.
Tarana? Sorry, we lost your connection. Can you hear me? We'll give her 1 minute just to see if she connects again. Anyway, the time is time to pass to the next panelist. I'm sure she will have time also to address the last point, maybe in some follow-up question. I just would like to interact with her before passing to the next panelist. So because I think she needs to leave the screen in order for the next expert to share her screen. Okay, then I'm
Yes.
so sorry, but your connection is keep freezing a bit. also the time it's a bit over. I would like to ask you if you can kindly maybe conclude now, and then I'm sure you will have time to address a few more points with the follow-up question, if it's
Okay,
possible.
sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so these are just the takeaways, key takeaways where we looked at, and our paper includes a tailored recommendations to the states for the prevention and prosecution and protection. And one of the major elements that we're pushing forward is non-punishment principle and looking at the consent of, in adult cases, but also very much relevant in the cases of children that are in conflict with the law. Thank you very much. Sorry for the disconnection.
No problem. Thank you so much for your intervention. Well, that shines, let's say, a crucial light on the intersection of trafficking and terrorism. And from my side, was very interesting, and is very interesting to see that is done by using the lens of human rights and victim recognition, which definitely offers a path towards more effective and just responses. I'm delighted to introduce our third expert today, who is Anne-Maria Sesma, who serves as a legal officer working at the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate. Her role at CITED involves providing expert support on law enforcement and border security issues within the framework of CITED efforts to monitor, to promote, and to facilitate member states' implementation of the relevant Security Council resolution on counterterrorism. Anne-Maria, it is a pleasure to have you today. As the UN Security Council recognized the connection between illicit trafficking in weapons and other forms of organized crimes, including terrorism. In light of this, would you please share your observation on the relationship between terrorism, trafficking in weapons and in person, and how the international responses could further be strengthened? Anne-Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaia, and a very good New York morning to all of you. I hope you can hear me well. Already compliments to the previous speakers, and of course the ICAT Secretariat and UNODC co-chairing. Thank you for having invited CITED to join this very important discussion. So actually, what I was thinking to elaborate is kind of a follow-up to Tarana's point already of the specificities of looking at these crimes and their specific features. But what I thought I would actually, from our perspective, our analysis and assessment, just elaborate and hopefully complement of what Tarana already presented of some of the indeed not only connections but also the specificities of trafficking persons, trafficking weapons, and that link of terrorism and how they are using these both forms of organized crime. And then additionally, the one issue that links all of them is of course the financial aspect. So as was already said by Gaia, that this is indeed our office, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. We serve the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, and indeed our mandate derives from the Council resolutions on counterterrorism. The very first one that established the Counterterrorism Committee is the 1373 resolution from 2001, which was adopted in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And since then, of course, the security landscape has evolved, and the mandate of CITED has been expanded to many different areas. And just to highlight really the Security Council's recognition of these connections is in several Security Council resolutions. Where the recognition of especially the growing convergence between terrorism and organized crime has been specifically and explicitly noted. So I would just mention a few. Resolution 2482 from 2019 urges the member states to conduct research and collect data to better understand these linkages. So this resolution really highlights this nexus between terrorism and organized crime. We have also dedicated resolutions from 2017. Resolution 2370 focuses on preventing terrorists from acquiring weapons, and it really lists multiple additional specific provisions for member states to implement at national level, and of course makes references to existing international instruments. Resolution 2462, 2019, calls for the criminalization of terrorist financing, which comes already, the offense comes from 2001 resolution 1373. But here in this resolution, the criminalization of terrorist financing and the freezing of assets linked to terrorism. There's also a resolution 2388 specifically encourages member states to analyze the financial flows associated with human trafficking and their potential use in financing terrorism. So this is just to illustrate, there are other resolutions, but this is to illustrate really the focus that has been recognized from the Security Council, and this of course is part of the international framework and instruments that pose obligations and requirements for member states to implement at national level. So of course it is already agreed that groups such as ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab and others have incorporated acts of exploitation of other forms of crime, and especially here associated with trafficking into their operational strategies. Currently, this is especially evident in parts of Africa, where we're looking at the sort of epicenter and shift of terrorism and terrorist groups, where already long-established trafficking routes have facilitated the movement of people and weapons and other commodities. Obviously, we are seeing a lot of linkages between other issues, so everything is linked. One is certainly that colleagues already mentioned, inadequate border controls, but also in the region very much poorly secured stockpiles that only increase the risk of weapons falling into terrorist hands. So what I thought I would just complement what has already been said is that the involvement of terrorist groups in human trafficking and weapons trafficking is also important to understand what is the difference in terms of purpose, methods and operational value. So, and this has been analyzed in also dialogue with member states and our research. So when it comes to human trafficking, already mentioned was that the terrorist groups exploiting human trafficking is much more multifunctional. So revenue generation was mentioned through forced labor, sexual exploitation, and also ransom. For operational support, such as using trafficked individuals for logistics, recruitment, or as combatants, and this is also applicable to children, as we unfortunately know. Ideological objectives, including forced marriages and indoctrination, and psychological warfare when using trafficking as a tool of terror and control over population and hence territorial also. When it comes to weapons trafficking in terms of purpose is more operational enhancement. So acquisition of firearms, also explosives, ammunition is mainly to carry out attacks. That is the number one. Of course, arming the recruits and supporters, affiliates is maintaining also control. Not only territorial, but maintaining control of populations and civilians in the area. Diversion of state or international stockpiles is to strengthen combat capabilities. When it comes to then to the modus operandi, then in human trafficking often involves already long-term exploitation of individuals. Recruits networks for recruitment, transport, and concealment. And this very often intersects with migration flows. And we've seen that when there are big peaks in migration flows, like which was the case, let's say in 2014-15, also in the midst of the phenomena of foreign terrorist fighters, especially in conflict zone or fragile states. The human trafficking also tends to peak with those migration flows. Also, in terms of operandi, it is victims are often also moved through coercion or deception or abduction. Then when we look at weapons trafficking in the modus operandi, this involves illicit procurement, obviously, smuggling and distribution of arms, and facilitated very often and now increasingly through black markets or corrupt officials, and of course online platforms. Also may involve barter systems, including exchanges for drugs or natural resources. It is also typically more transactional and logistics focused than human trafficking. When it comes to looking at visibility and detection, and this is important part to look at the differences, because it also impacts then what was mentioned, the investigative part and prosecution. So in human trafficking, it is more covert and difficult to detect, especially in conflict zones. Victims also may not self-identify, and the evidence is often hard to collect. Investigations are very complicated, and this has a lot of different issues that impact that complication, which is, for example, lack of documentation and cross-border movements. When we then look at weapons trafficking, it is easier to detect through customs inspections, border surveillance, and forensic tracing, because we're looking at objects. Seizures also can often be linked to specific supply chains, already existing ones, or conflict zones where we know already the presence of terrorist groups and obviously their need to get access to weapons. Although this is only possible through systematic tracing. What was mentioned already, that indeed in many areas, not only in Latin America, like was mentioned by a colleague, but Africa and elsewhere, systematic tracing is indeed not conducted. But that has, again, many linking issues, such as marking of weapons or issues in terms of looking at new ways of concealment, and we have also already learned that some seized weapons could have been also transferred between different terrorist groups. However, the point here being that there are detection mechanisms more established when we're looking at weapons trafficking in comparison to human trafficking. Also, more likely to be tracked to serial numbers, ballistics, or export records, if they exist, can help obviously to detect weapons trafficking by terrorists. Then lastly, if we look at legal and policy responses in human trafficking, obviously we have human rights, criminal law frameworks, but often requires also victim-centered approaches, protection, rehabilitation, etc. Other forms also of public or government responses. However, often under-resourced in counterterrorism strategies. And here is one actually common denominator with also weapons trafficking, which I'll come back later. When it comes to weapons trafficking, it is more likely to be treated as national security issue, an arms control issue. Again, we do have international treaties. Of course, both are under UNTOC and their specific protocols. In firearms, we have also additionally Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Program of Action, etc. So there are those. However, what we see it is still often treated more at national level and not necessarily the cross-border element in comparison to human trafficking. It is more integrated in counterterrorism and military operations, unlike human trafficking. However, both human trafficking, weapons trafficking, we often still see disconnect with counterterrorism architecture at national level. They are not mentioned in counterterrorism strategies, nor the potentially dedicated strategies like firearms strategy or border security, border control strategy are not linked or referenced or cross-referenced with counterterrorism strategies or action plans. Finally, financial implications. So in human trafficking obviously generates sustained income through exploitation. Financial flows often are hidden in informal or cash-based economies, less frequently linked to formal financial investigations. Then in weapons trafficking involves obviously high value, but more likely to be one-time transactions. Also may be financed through illicit trade, state sponsors even, or criminal alliances. Easier to trace through banking system or shell companies or crypto transactions, which in human trafficking might be non-existent or non-visible. Very last point, what is the policy and operational gap? So if we look at the international sphere and not national level specifically, international response, it is important to note that there already exists a comprehensive international legal framework, from UNTOG and its protocols to indeed Security Council resolutions and other instruments. However, the enforcement at national level is what creates the gaps, and states' commitment to the implementation of the legal framework. So that is one that definitely can be strengthened at international level. Like I said, link it between counterterrorism strategies, law enforcement, border management, firearms strategy, and financing of terrorism at overall looking more in a complementary and comprehensive manner. Despite this growing awareness, we still treat these threats in isolation. The covert nature, of course, of trafficking, lack of data, limited investigative capacity have hindered these effective responses or a way of looking at these phenomenon or these crimes in link. Moreover, we still find that many states remain unaware of their own vulnerabilities to the interconnected threats of trafficking and terrorism, or they lack the tools to assess them. The financial aspect of human and weapons trafficking remains largely overlooked. Often law enforcement agencies fail to conduct financial investigations alongside trafficking cases. However, tracing and analyzing the financial flows can be instrumental in not just only identifying the networks, but the perpetrators and dismantling the networks and disrupting terrorist financing. More comprehensive research, data collection, colleagues already mentioned, essential to that we can establish the extent to which terrorist groups benefit, not only operationally, but also financially from human trafficking and weapons trafficking. And like I said, the benefit of might be different. How they benefit from human trafficking, how they benefit from weapons trafficking, there are the differences. And this where member states are encouraged to share this information more at the international level and obviously with international organizations. So conclude that the nexus, or addressing the nexus, terrorism, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, we do need, of course, more holistic approaches, but the ingredients to that, it is easy to say holistic, intelligence-led, international, coordinated. However, the ingredients for that is really to get the data, understand it better, also understand the differences, and then link border security, financial investigations and the cooperation to really look at this interconnectivity. So I'll leave it at there and leave some room for follow-up questions. So back to you, Gaia.
Thank you so much. Central to our mission is definitely understanding the complex, the multi-phase challenge of stopping weapons from reaching terrorists, especially when it happens because of poorly secure stockpiles and weak border controls, and understanding the specific difficulties in detection of each crimes. So thank you, Maria, for complementing what already has been highlighted by the previous expert on these critical issues. And last, we have Sara Pinheiro-Stocker from UNODC's Firearms Trafficking section. Sara is a crime prevention and criminal justice officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes. Sara has worked in the international security field for over 10 years, including in the European Commission services for migration and home affairs and for international partnership. She has also worked for association representing the European security industry. Sara holds a law degree from the University of Lisbon and a master in European studies from the College of Europe. Sara, welcome. I understand that since you joined UNODC in 2022, you lead the development of knowledge, innovation, and analysis on firearms trafficking and related crimes, including other forms of trafficking. In 10 minutes, may you please share with us your insights on the interlinkages between firearms trafficking and trafficking in person? Additionally, could you provide some examples or case studies? Sara, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Gaia. And just, I believe you can see my presentation. I hope you do.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me just set it up. So first of all, I would like to thank UNODC and OAS colleagues who have proposed this topic, which is of course very important to us, at this ICAT webinar, and inviting the Firearms Trafficking section to share our perspectives on this. I'm just going to start my timer so I don't go over it. I also wanted to thank all the participants who have joined today. It is my pleasure to be with you. So the fellow panelists have wonderfully framed the issue and the possible interlinkages, the international framework, and possible responses. Some of what I may say will sound familiar, but I hope it may also serve to reinforce some of the messages that have already been shared, and also from an illicit flows perspective that we very much look at. So let me move the slide. So first of all, just very briefly, I would like to share with you our strategic approach in the firearms trafficking section from the Global Firearms Program. It has many pillars that cover a legal framework, effective international cooperation, proportionate criminal justice responses, people-centered approaches, and of course, enhanced firearms control. But I have, as you said, Gaia, been focusing on this pillar on increased knowledge and responsiveness through strategic analysis. And within this pillar, we have actually been developing an issue paper precisely on the interlinkages that are the object of this webinar, on the interlinkage between illicit firearms and trafficking in persons. So I will be presenting some of the findings we included on this. So you can see my second slide at this point, I hope. Yeah, okay. And of interest may also be, because this was brought up by some of the previous panelists, an issue paper that we actually already published on the links between arms, crime, and conflict. So if you are interested, I will then include the links on the presentation, and they are available, both our new strategic approach and the issue papers that we have been developing. I see that there's some issue maybe with the slides. Let's see. Can you see it or not? The second slide and now the third slide.
We are just saying the first one.
Yes, and some people saying no, so I don't know.
I'm so sorry. I see that slide number 3 in this moment. Don't know if
Yeah.
other people see different screen. I see the
Yeah.
first.
Okay, let me try to. Okay. Okay. I'm not sure what to do about it. I can try to like share it again.
Yes, please, Sarah, try to share it again. Otherwise, I would suggest maybe you can proceed with your presentation and then posing the slide in the chat so everyone
Okay,
can
I think
have.
now I see that it looks
Okay.
different. So maybe I think now it might be working because also for me it looks different than it was
Okay,
before.
for me it works as before, but other
Okay,
colleagues
for me it
maybe.
looks different. So I hope for the participants
I think it is
as well.
working now, Sarah.
Okay, great. I'm glad. Okay, all right. So this was basically the strategic approach that I was mentioning, and this is the issue paper. I will put the links to this. You can find them on our website. And moving forward, not to take any more time. So in this issue paper, we have identified, and I think these views were also shared by the previous panelists, that there are 3 main strands of this interconnected nature of firearms trafficking and human trafficking. So both crimes often rely on an overlapping networks, on overlapping facilitators and transport routes. Criminal groups exploit these shared infrastructures to move both people and weapons, and they enhance their operational reach and control. Victims of human trafficking in some cases are coerced into transporting firearms or are forced into armed roles to support activities of criminal groups. Firearms are used to intimidate, to coerce, and maintain control over victims, as well as to defend traffickers against law enforcement or rival groups. Operating in dangerous and often contested environments, human traffickers rely on firearms not only to enforce compliance, but also to assert dominance. And in the map, we wanted to highlight some key regions where we see a conversion of firearms and trafficking in persons that are the most evident for us. And basically, we see this as a cycle of violence. While not all cases of trafficking in persons occur in conflict zones, the widespread availability of illicit firearms significantly contributes to instability and violence, especially in already fragile regions. The proliferation of trafficked weapons escalates local tensions and fuels armed violence, often forcing people then to flee their homes in search for safety. This dynamic is particularly evident in regions such as Latin America, as mentioned by Pierre, and the Middle East, where armed groups and criminal networks use firearms to maintain control. As violence displaces communities, individuals, particularly women and children, become increasingly vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking. I also wanted to mention that we have looked into the gender dimensions linked to firearms in trafficking in person context. So we saw that gender really plays a critical role in shaping both the dynamics and the impacts of firearms trafficking and exploitation. In many cultural contexts, firearms are closely associated with traditional expressions of masculinity, often reinforcing some aggressive behavior. Men who represent a majority of firearms owners are both the primary perpetrators and victims of gun-related violence, including homicides, gender-based violence, and in armed conflict. This gendered pattern extends to smuggling and trafficking networks where men and boys are not only dominant actors, but also frequent targets of coercion and abuse, and often forced into criminal activities. Women, girls, and LGBTQI+ individuals are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence, especially within the context of trafficking in persons. Many are coerced into sexual exploitation. They are often denied access to healthcare or other services. the fear of stigma, deportation, or retaliation, particularly in cases where authorities are complicit in the abuse, creates a barrier to reporting such experiences. While women are often portrayed solely as victims, they can also occupy various roles within trafficking networks, commonly in positions such as recruitment, safe house management, or in some cases as traffickers themselves. Importantly, many of these women have history of exploitation, so they have been victims themselves, and it makes it very difficult to distinguish between exploitation and active participation. I think this was also mentioned in some of the cases shared by Tarana. Despite this complexity, women are disproportionately prosecuted for trafficking-related offenses compared to other crimes, and this underscores the need for a gender-sensitive approach to prevention, protection, and prosecution. So I wanted to share with you, sorry, I think this is the right one now. As you asked for, Gaia, some case studies that we have included. So I wanted to share, of course, this is well known, the Libya case study as a dual hub for firearms and trafficking in persons. Since the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, Libya has become one of the major hubs for firearms trafficking and human displacement in the Sahel region. The post-revolution power vacuum has left the country fragmented with armed groups, militias, and political factions controlling key territories. These groups depend on continuous supply of illicit weapons, fueling the proliferation of firearms within Libya and across its borders, particularly into Mali, through Tuareg trafficking networks. Libya's strategic location near Europe has also made it a long-standing corridor for migrant smuggling and trafficking. Migrants transiting the country face abuse, including sexual violence, torture, extortion, and forced labor, especially in detention centers. Some of them are operated by militias. Women and children are especially at risk, often coerced into sexual acts in exchange for food and water, and release. Sorry. So another case study is, again, a very well-known, unfortunate situation in Haiti, where you have a very, very close intersection and interaction between firearms gangs and exploitation. Haiti is currently facing one of the most severe crises of armed violence globally, driven by inequality, political instability, natural disasters in its past. Over the past 15 years, the country suffered a series of earthquakes, health epidemics, and then assassination of its president. This led to the collapse of critical systems and infrastructure. In the absence of effective governance, Haiti has become a key destination for illicitly trafficked high-caliber firearms and ammunitions, a lot of them originating from the United States. These weapons have empowered gangs and now control significant territory and critical infrastructures, including ports, roads, airports, courts, prisons. This fragile security situation has exacerbated some of the economic conditions and exposed populations, especially women and children, to increased risks of trafficking, including forced domestic servitude, labor exploitation, and sexual violence. Children are also especially vulnerable, and they are often targeted for gang recruitment or exploited in unregulated and illicit labor markets. The escalating violence and insecurity have then, of course, triggered large-scale displacement, with tens of thousands of Haitians undertaking dangerous migration routes, where many fall victim to traffickers during their journey. So very briefly, because I'm past my time, some examples of good international responses in our view have been some of the operations that we have conducted together with Interpol, like Trigger 9 operation. This was the largest firearms-focused operation in Latin America at that date. It involved many countries, and we had, of course, arrests, seizures of firearms, drugs, precursors to explosives. We had also a disruption of a wide range of transnational crime. networks, including human trafficking, terrorism, and crimes against the environment. Then there is, of course, the Global Action to Prevent and Address Trafficking in Persons, which is implemented also by UNODC with IOM and UNICEF, and from the European side, coordinated by Europol, the EU Joint Action Days from 2023 that also resulted in the arrest related to human trafficking. So this is for me, but I still have a list of 7, I believe, recommendations, if I have the time to say what our recommendations would be based on this sort of framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. If no one asks you that question, well, I will definitely. I'm interested in knowing the recommendation. I thank you for the interesting cases and for, well, illuminating the crucial links between trafficking in person, micro-smuggling, firearms trafficking, of course, understanding this connection through shared root actors and the use of firearms for coercion is essential for an effective intervention. At this point, the panel presentation have concluded. I would like to thank all the panelists for their valuable contribution. And please, it's time for everyone to put their question in the chat or raise their hands. In the meantime, I will just conclude, let's say, that as we have heard, terrorist organizations exploit human trafficking for funding and recruitment, which is a deadly combination for expanding their reach. Firearms trafficking compounds this, providing the means to enforce control and escalate conflict. This nexus is particularly concerning because the illicit trade in weapons fuels terrorist activities directly, but also create an environment of instability and violence that can further exacerbate human trafficking. Crucially, on top of everything, technologies now amplifies this nexus, complicating the global picture that certainly our 4 experts expose in a very more complex and well-structured way than what I just summarized now. And this is why we are enthusiastic in having them ready for answer some of our questions. Let's see if there's any specific question in the chat. If not, in the meantime, I will proceed with some questions from my side. And at this point, I will start with Pierre. Pierre, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask you, given the multi-phase nature of these overlapping threats, how do you see governments, international partners, and civil society strengthening their coordination to enhance national and regional responses?
Thanks, Gaia, for the questions, and thanks for all the other panelists, because I think they also provided more additional insights on the issue. And I think, as it's been mentioned by everyone here, there are so many interconnections, and the challenges are to address it come from different sources. So we require like a multidimensional response, both at the government level, but also in cooperation with other agencies, with civil society, with other countries. And because it's so complex to have coordinated responses when they are across different institutions, I think that's why it's so challenging to address this. And not to say about the specific deficiencies and gaps within the institutions that have already been mentioned. So for instance, we don't do systematic tracing because we don't have the marking at the beginning of the supply chain, and then we don't have information going across the different agencies. We work with databases when we do have databases in silos. So there are operational specific deficiencies within each institution, but there is also the major gap of how do we coordinate all these actors. And one of the strategies that we see that have been very efficient in terms of addressing firearms trafficking is the sub-regional roadmaps. And that's a specific strategy that will assist us in also bringing together all these actors working in a coordinated way with targets, with specific actions, indicators that can actually may support us in seeing what's the progress and what are the corrections that are necessary. Because we talk a lot about coordination, but if there is no concrete plans on how do we coordinate each other, and if there are no specific spaces for that coordination to flow, it's very hard to achieve meaningful results. So in the case of the sub-regional roadmaps, of course, the first one and the most successful in terms of implementation, because it's the longest one, is the one in the Western Balkans that has achieved a lot of success in supporting Western Balkan states in improving their practices to close some of those gaps and contain firearms flows. And then in our region, we have the Caribbean Firearms Roadmap and the Central American Firearms Roadmap. And we are in dialogue with the Andean countries to have an Andean Firearms Roadmap. And in all those roadmaps, in our region at least, we do have goals and actions that speak about the interconnections and the linkages with other modalities of organized crime. And they are also able to address all these deficiencies that we've mentioned, tracing, stockpile management, and in a coordinated way. There's a governance structure, and I think this is the most added value of the roadmaps, where the different institutions can sit and can talk about the action plan. They can review what are the indicators, the targets, what progress have been achieved. And there's also coordination instances like implementing partners, civil society organizations that help us bringing all these actors together to implement a specific plan and with a specific deadline. So I think that's kind of I think the most successful strategy that could be implemented across the different modalities of organized crime, to have roadmaps, action plans, and to have the spaces, the dialogue spaces, the governance structure, so we can all coordinate our work, like both civil society, governments, institutions, academia, that have to come together so we can see more meaningful results.
Thank you so much. Now, Tarana, in addition to the terrorism nexus research, you also lead OSCE's works on financial intelligence into human trafficking. How do terrorist organizations use human trafficking networks to finance their operations?
Thanks, Gaia. So, do you hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
So, I think it's a good question. And Anna Maria already answered some of those questions in her presentations when we talked about funding, whether or not trafficking actually funds terrorism. To that, just the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, just came out with a report on July 5th, which already talks about how terrorism has proliferated in terms of the illicit financial flows. That also goes the same to trafficking, with digitalization of payment system, with the different payment products being available. Trafficking has emerged with the different illicit financial flows. We have to also understand that trafficking is not a static crime. It's very involved crime. If we talk about sexual exploitation, we see now increasing the children are being exploited in forced criminality, particularly in the violent crimes, which can be defined as terrorism in many countries as well. They use firearms, they use the weapons now. So this also shows how much there is a financial means also behind those crimes that needs to be further examined. And that's also been our recommendation back in 2021 and still remains valid, that financial intelligence investigations in parallel to criminal investigations is very crucial to identify and trace those links. The cash is still a king in trafficking, and I believe it's still a king in terrorism, as I read from the reports of FATF. But how the cash is then being layered through the money laundering schemes is an area that still needs to be understood to see where the money then goes. If it's cash, then it's actually being deposited to other areas like luxury businesses, to some other business sectors, to some other legal business sectors even. So that requires a lot of more examination, close examination when we're talking about both the crimes, even the traditional trafficking and many understanding of sexual exploitation, for example, is still unclear how much illicit financial flows. There are different figures come out every year. The ILO has one figure, and NASDAQ Verifin has gave another figure. So that also creates already a data that there is an illicit financial flow. How much of that and what type of innocent financial flows still needs to be examined. That is to say that both crimes have proliferated. There is an increase in convergence between both crimes because trafficking now evolved into different other crimes. So that means actually by looking at one crime, we don't have to just look at terrorism, but all types of predicated offenses within one crime setting. It's particularly relevant for the financial institutions, financial intelligence units, and financial investigators that one single indicator will not give you a predicate offense, but combination of different indicators will likely provide you much more actionable intelligence, much more actionable suspicions that can be reported to FIU. So that is to say, there's definitely an area to be examined further. There is a financial motive. There is other motives when the terrorist groups actually engaged in trafficking. We could see from the Yazidi exploitation as well. So that still needs to be examined, and I believe it's still not very clear data exists up to now.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. The discussion is absolutely interesting, and we will finish, of course, the round of questions. I just would have to remind that we have 10 minutes overall also to conclude a little bit. So I will keep that in mind, and I will pose my next question to Anne-Maria. And I would like to know if it's possible to explore further, unfortunately, given the time frame, but what would be the key measures to strengthen states' capabilities to better respond to these forms of crimes, the nexus, including following the recommendation from the seated assessment and analysis.
Thanks, Gaia. I can be quick and very concise. 4 main recommendations where we constantly see the gaps in our assessments and make recommendations. So the very first one that I would put as the highest, risk management. It is a critical process in strengthening states' capabilities, and this is to prevent trafficking persons, weapons, terrorist financing, and we constantly see that it is not conducted in a systematic manner. And why is this important? Because first of all, risk management is the only methodology that relevant authorities through which can identify vulnerabilities. Where are the vulnerabilities? What is the residual risk and how to mitigate it? Border control, financial networks, supply chains, all of it. Recognizing patterns and indicators of trafficking can only be revealed if risk management is understood. Not only threat assessment. Threat assessment is just identifying what are the threats specific to your country. Risk management is actually conducting the entire cycle of looking at what are your current capabilities to respond to these crimes and what is the residue, meaning where is your vulnerability? Is your risk acceptable or do you need to mitigate? So risk management I would put absolutely on top, and it also is a way to be more efficient in allocating resources of the government. Part of that will also actually feed into the second one, which is information exchange between domestic agencies. Actually, you cannot do risk management unless you have a good interagency operation mechanism built into that. All domestic agencies feeding information into the process. So that leads to the second one, which is the mechanisms to ensure timely exchange of information between domestic agencies, respectively responsible for the investigation of human trafficking, weapons, terrorism, money laundering, and terrorist financing. Third one is the recommendation, like actually Tarana already mentioned or elaborated it, is to states to introduce clear legal basis for parallel investigations and to establish the policies and standard operating procedures to ensure that relevant financial flows are considered in every whether it's investigating terrorism, weapons, or human trafficking. And the last one, we talked about ICT new technologies and of course how terrorists and organized criminals are using it, but also we should look how invaluable tool that could be for us, for government and authorities to detect and disrupt human trafficking networks, financing terrorism and trafficking of weapons networks. So actually using it, the new technologies that present the opportunities for us to use for positive, but also to actually intervene and intercept these networks. So I leave it to those four. Thanks, Gaia.
Thank you so much, and I couldn't agree more as we are working on technology and, yeah, of course, the threats, but also how to use it for government purpose and to fight terrorism. So thank you for all of your recommendation. I will now pass the floor to Sara. Sara, I would like to know some of those recommendations if you have them to share. And in general, what measures should states take to tackle this connection in concrete terms? Thank you so much.
Yes, so to be maybe very brief, I actually prepared a slide with some of this. There are 7 recommendations. Some of them have already been touched upon. So of course, we really believe that improving data collection related to the use, origin, and impact of firearms in trafficking in persons cases, it would be very useful because we found a lot of big data gap on this to better understand the interlinkages. We would also see it came out very, very prominently from the analysis we conducted that victim protection mechanisms should be very much strengthened. And this is to reduce their vulnerability, but also to prevent them from being re-trafficked. We would like to see better gender responsive policies to the risks faced by specific vulnerable groups. And then looking more at part of the work we do as well on criminal justice responses, we advocate repeatedly for the creation of joint investigative teams with knowledge of both types of trafficking, also parallel investigations as mentioned, and the creation of national focal points that can compile and coordinate the data, but also assist with MLA requests. We promote cross-border cooperation through coordinated investigations and sharing of data. We always try to make the point that we should go after the trafficker, the network, and not stop at the seizure of the firearm or at the interception of the victims of trafficking. Of course, we try to support the investment in training and capacity development of law enforcement, of border management authorities, of judicial institutions to improve the identification, investigation, prosecution, and adjudication of trafficking cases, in our case of firearms trafficking, and the engagement of civil society. We really recognize their role also as a first line of alert and the contributions they can give to evidence-based policy and analysis because they are closer sometimes to the issue, to the field, to the victims. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, now looking at the time, so then closing for today, I would like, first of all, to extend our great appreciation, of course, to our excellent speakers, whose valuable insight and thoughtful contribution were instrumental to having such a fruitful discussion, setting also the tone for the upcoming webinars. It is only through sharing their insight and expertise that conversations such the one we just had today will contribute to an effective and comprehensive response to trafficking in person globally. The recording of this webinar will be published on the ICAT website, and the Secretariat will communicate with all participants as soon as it is published. Lastly, I thank the ICAT member for promoting the webinar series and the ICAT co-chair UNODC and the OAS and the Secretariat for leading the initiative. We look forward to see you again in the upcoming webinar, which, as we already reminded, will address the nexus between trafficking in person, cyber, and cyber-enabled crime. This webinar is planned for the next 25th of September, and more information will be shared with those who register for the webinars. So please note the registration are open and remains open, and either for encourage you all to continue spreading the word to all who may be interested. Thank you all, and have a great day, and we can say bye and close the meeting. Thank you.
Many
Thank you so
thanks.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.